There's a number of people who, when they got laid off during the dot-com bust, sort of gave up. Maybe
Right.
early if they just hang in there a little longer, there'll be more demand just by shortage, if nothing else.
Absolutely. About 10 million shortage of workers in the U.S. by 2020, if everyone retires sort of on schedule. And we are seeing people that have been out of work for many years coming back, not necessarily to exactly what they were doing before, but they retire, they either get bored or they get involved in a hobby that becomes a business. And so they return to the workforce in that fashion.
You know, relating to your comment about health, I'm wondering whether or not there's also the mental health portion, that you feel more invigorated when you're still working, that you're maybe sharper by solving problems. Remember, there have been some studies where if you do puzzles, I wonder, even just not just a matter of living longer, but being just sharper and less depressed. Do you think that that's a factor,
Absolutely.
those two things as well?
And in the book that you mentioned, we have an appendix, and I pushed it to the appendix, and I got depressed writing it. Originally, we called it the grim reality of retirement. We changed it just to the reality of retirement. People have a vision of travel and time with their grandchildren, and then they discover that their friends who didn't retire don't have time for them. They have trouble making conversations at cocktail parties. They always spend more money than they expected to. And unfortunately, we see things like the extra hours getting eaten up by watching television. Mm-hmm. And it's sad. So the dreams of retirement go away. And it turns out it's sort of like eating dessert constantly. You think travel would be so wonderful,
like
but
cheesecake.
if you had nothing but cheesecake, you'd get tired of it.
Yeah.
You appreciate your vacations. You appreciate your time with your grandchildren more if it isn't 52 weeks of the year.
Yeah, actually, I had one guest on the show that said there's definitely a difference between vacation and retirement. It's like maybe the first 6 months of retirement is this pictured vacation, and now what? Now what are you going to do for the next 23 years?
Right. So there, as you say, the psychological benefits. I mean, Starbucks is a very successful company because it created a third place where people can go. You don't want to just spend all your time at home. And you can have a third place like a club or a Starbucks, but you need that second place, which is your workplace.
Yeah.
And if that disappears, then you're half the time at home and half the time at Starbucks. That gets expensive.
Yeah.
Or your club, and even if you go to work for a charity, it's been rather sad to see that people with very excellent credentials get treated doing things like, pouring water in a hospital instead of working at their level. We tend to, and any mother can tell you this, we tend to devalue that which is not paid for.
Okay.
And that's what happens. People think, well, I'm going to volunteer and I'm going to be out there, running the Red Cross or something, and they discover all they're doing is sorting Band-Aids.
Mm-hmm.
So,
is there a way they can
yes.
volunteer and aim towards something engaging? They don't want to work for pay?
Sure. There's two things they can do. First, they can get a job with their favorite cause as a job, as a paid job. The other is they can continue with their current paid job and spend volunteer time out of hours, donate money to their cause, things like that. Now, the charities and the nonprofits are getting smart, and they're starting to structure volunteer work much like jobs, with performance reviews and promotions and everything else. So choose a charity like that, and you can have a big impact at your level without having paid work.
Fantastic. Now, you brought along a graphic that has to do with some of the different ways to keep working, because we were talking about not retiring so quickly, right? So what are these people going to do? And I thought what we'd do is we'd show this to the audience and I'd read the bullet points.
Sure.
And you can comment. Okay, so you have basically 3 ways to keep working. One is to stay with your current employer.
Right, and that's probably the most common and the easiest. Now, you don't want to necessarily sit in the same desk for 50 years. You want to, so your company needs to be big enough that you can move around, you can broaden, either climb the ladder or broaden your responsibilities, find new things to do. And that's one of the challenges. And Robin Bond, who wrote the foreword to my book, she's an employment attorney, and she said she gets lots of people who've been offered a package.
Oh, yeah,
and so it's a real challenge if you've taken that path that you want to stay with your current employee to just hold on like this. And the people who've been successful at it go to think about where their employer is going, whether it's geographically or industry-wise, and get ahead of that and say, look, I don't have to do what I've been doing, which is now redundant. I can go do this. For example, pilots are mandatory retirement at age 60 in the large airlines. A smart pilot would start at about 50 and get an MBA so he could get an office job after he was told that he could no longer fly. So that's the way to stay with your current employer. Not always possible.
Actually hit on a good point. Excuse me for my ignorance, but are there mandatory retirement ages for typical jobs like software engineers, or can people work as long as the company? I mean, do they force people to retire anymore?
Very few. There are some government and military jobs. Typically, it's only in a case where public safety is involved, such as pilots, engineers on railroad trains, this type of thing. And then some, mainly where mandatory retirement comes in is in executive positions.
Okay. The second point is go out on your own, and you break that into three pieces: freelance, entrepreneur, and small business owner.
Well, an entrepreneur is a person who is building a business that expects to grow. And typically, it's not one person. You get together with a group of people and you start a company and you want it to be the next Google or the next Microsoft. And that's not always possible. You need an idea, you need funding, and so on. More common is for a person to buy a small business, either in the local dry cleaners or something like that, or buy a franchise of a company that has operations all across the country, all around the world. And then even more common is to simply hang out your shingle, as they say. I was in the technical publications department, now I'm going to be a freelance artist or technical writer, or you write books, or you write articles, or you make movies. That's perhaps the more creative type of being on your own.
Okay. And then the third option to keep working is to find a new employer.
Right. It isn't always possible to stay with the employer you have. They've been bought out, moved to the other coast, turfed you out in one way or another, or you're just tired of working there. And you want to find a new job. And this is the most difficult course, especially if you want to change fields.
This is when you go to a career coach, right?
Right, exactly. That's the point. And then sometimes people don't know what they want to do. They just know they don't want to do what they've been doing and they don't want to retire. So they may go back to school and so on. But this is when they run into either real or imaginary age discrimination, especially if they change fields. So now they're 52 comparing, and they've just got a new degree, and they're competing with people who are 22. And so that's a difficult situation.
Okay. I wanted to ask you a quick question about age discrimination, and then we're going to go to a little clip that you...
Okay.
But tell us about age discrimination at all ages.
I found it interesting. Of course, I'd heard the complaints about age discrimination from boomers and seniors. But when I started researching it, I found far more complaints on the web, perhaps because younger people use the web, about discrimination against young people. And I had one person who had started at a company at 19. When he got 20 years, he asked for retirement. And they said, oh, well, we forgot to tell you, you have to be 45 to get your pension, in addition to 20 years. And some of the younger people, for example, if they're involved in entrepreneurship, they have a very difficult time raising money because they're perceived as not being, having enough years under their belt, if you will.
So everybody has a bit of
everybody. It's all a matter of stereotyping.
Okay. You collect success stories. Tell us what a success story is, and then maybe tell us what we're going to see in this clip that we're going to see.
Well, I started collecting success stories of people who've done really interesting career things late in life, and a woman who started an orphanage in her 80s, a 92-year-old social worker,
wow,
and so on. And I'm still collecting them. If people have them, I'd like them to send them to me. We were only able to use about 20 of the ones we had collected in the book. We're going to do a whole book on just success stories, people who've had promotions or made lasting contributions after the age of 42.